Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be here. I need to pay one or two homages before I begin. However, for the last 3 days, I've been bedridden with fever, which we couldn't figure out what exactly had happened to me. But my wife, Kondo, who is in Maryland, nursed me and did the things that was necessary so that I could be here today. So I want to send a special, some special positive energy to Maryland, to her. B, I would also like to acknowledge just a few friends real quickly. Brother Wilford, who I haven't seen in a while. That's all right. I appreciate that, but that's not even necessary. They know. Sister Susan and Allie Bay and their daughter Kusha. Brother Lambe Graff, who I hadn't seen in a while. And Brother Preston Wilcox, who I haven't seen in a while as well. And then there are several other people, and I think they know who they are. Thank you very much. Now, time is of the essence, and so I'm not going to waste a lot of time. The assassination of Malcolm X. I first began studying the assassination of Malcolm X 11 years ago. And I'll be frank with you. When I first started studying the assassination of Malcolm X, I had a political motive. And my motive was I wanted to exonerate the Nation of Islam because there were bits and pieces of evidence that linked the Nation of Islam to Malcolm's assassination. I didn't like that because, see, to me what should have happened is, since Malcolm was killed and wasn't much I could do about it then, I was 5 years old when Malcolm was assassinated, so I couldn't do much about that. But what I could do is, through my research, I could at least say that we, our people, did not kill one of our own. So that's what motivated me. It was simple enough to me to assume that the enemy killed Malcolm. And if you're going to be a martyr, if you're going to be a servant for your people, that's the best way to go. That is, let the enemy kill you. Of course, we need to talk about that too, because one of the mistakes we made in the past is that we've given up too many leaders to the enemy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Time is of the essence. So at any rate, this is what I began my study with. As I began to dig deeper and deeper, I became a little bit more disappointed. I would say about halfway through, it was clear to me that some elements of the Nation of Islam was involved in Malcolm's assassination. So it became clear to me that I could not exonerate the nation as a whole. So then I said, well, okay, perhaps I can exonerate the national leadership. So I kept on going. And I went deeper and deeper. And then after a short period of time, it became clear to me there were some elements in the national leadership. So I couldn't exonerate the national leadership as a whole. So perhaps then I could exonerate Elijah Muhammad. So I dug deeper and deeper and deeper. And then I realized that I couldn't even exonerate the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. That is, I realized, and it hurt me to realize it, that Malcolm's assassination, so far as the Nation of Islam was concerned, came all the way from the top. So that was disappointing enough. But of course, with all of that, I was also dealing with another important element. And of course, that was the enemy's role. And of course, one of the things that I was most concerned about is, which was the puppet and which was the puppeteer. Well, it became very clear to me as I kept going that the puppet was the nation, and the puppeteer was the FBI specifically. Now, how did all of this happen? Well, as I discussed in my book, it was actually quite simple. The Bureau had long had a disruption campaign. Not just for organizations like the Nation, any organizations, any black organization, any Negro organization, any African organization. Of course, they also had disruption campaigns for European organizations too. Liberal, so-called, conservative, so-called, moderate, so-called. So this was old hat. But in the case of the Nation of Islam, though, I don't know if some of the disruption campaigns of the enemy worked as well. And it was a very simple program. It worked like this. The Nation learned very early on that Malcolm had lots of enemies inside the national leadership of the nation. And all they did was to exploit it. They did not invent one conflict. All they did was inflamed existing ones. And in fact, we can't even blame the enemy. We really can't even blame the enemy for the conflicts inside the nations. All they did was they built on it. And they did it. Some of the stuff, as I look back on it today, was to bring tears to my eyes. They would do real simple things. For example, because they had bugs on telephones, they listened to conversations and they studied conversations. And then what they would do is they would then come up with a newspaper article, plant newspaper articles, spread rumors, send poison pen letters that would then promote whatever it is that they just heard through a phone tap or some type of bug or some type of microphone surveillance or something like that. And then they would listen for the reaction of Elijah Muhammad, for the reaction of an Elijah Muhammad Jr., of a John Ali, of a Raymond Sharif, or of a local minister. And then that would tell them what their next move should be. The whole key to Malcolm's downfall in the nation, and remember, assassination doesn't come until way down the line. We make a mistake if we assume that immediately the enemy immediately had plans to destroy Malcolm as far as killing him. No, they were satisfied first to separate Malcolm from Elijah Muhammad. That was the first major test of the Bureau schemes. They accomplished that in 1963. And they used some very interesting tactics to do that as well. But in many ways, we contributed very easily. The Savior's Day Convention, for example, was a major contribution to the division between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And by the way, it's very important to understand, the key to Malcolm's division from the Nation of Islam was separating Malcolm from his support base inside the Nation of Islam, which plain and simple was Elijah Muhammad. That's what the key was. And what began to happen is, by late 1962, various seeds were circulating. They've been planted. That then Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad both are going to kind of feed into. A couple issues are going to be important. A is going to be the whole question of secession. That is, who is going to take over the nation once Elijah Muhammad left this plane? And remember now, beginning late 1962 and throughout most of 1963, Elijah Muhammad is very ill. So when that happened, the secession question became even more astute. And of course, there were basically two major wings. One wing said it would be a member of the national leadership, i.e. Elijah Muhammad's family. Another wing said it would be Malcolm. Now, originally, Elijah Muhammad did not seem to have much problem in all of this, because it was very clear to everybody that he was satisfied with what Malcolm was doing. And so there was this assumption, it wasn't talked about, but there was an assumption that Malcolm would basically take over. And if not Malcolm, perhaps one of his family, if anybody, perhaps Wallace, because he was considered to be the most spiritual. But the overall energy was that Malcolm would take over. Now, the Savior's Day Convention is going to be very important in all of this. Because for the first time, the enemy is going to get a good sense that there's more division between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad than there was earlier. Elijah Muhammad is going to be sick, so he's going to be in Phoenix during this time. So he's not going to be able to attend. Malcolm is going to preside. And from the time that Malcolm hit Chicago, Elijah Muhammad was getting a series of phone calls to his estate in Phoenix from members of his family constantly complaining about Malcolm. Malcolm this and Malcolm that. So much so that following the Savior's Day, Elijah Muhammad ordered Malcolm back to Chicago. Back to New York. Now this became very important. What that told the Bureau was that even though Elijah Muhammad loved Malcolm, there were limits to that love. And in fact, we came across a memo, which I'm just going to kind of summarize real quickly in the interest of time. We know it's hot and we're trying to really be sensitive to what's going on here. But this was a very important memo. This is the March 11th memo. And in this memo, what the Bureau is basically doing is outlining the scheme that they were going to use to separate Malcolm from Elijah Muhammad. Now, this memo was prepared by the Chicago SAC, that special agent in charge. And he sent this to Hoover. Quote, at this point, Chicago, that's the Chicago FBI, at this point, Chicago does not recommend that any disruption tactics in the form of anonymous letters, which is one of their major techniques, or phone calls, bogus phone calls, be instituted. It is apparent Elijah Muhammad at this time is backing Malcolm and is giving him, to some degree, a free hand. It is also apparent Muhammad has no intentions of allowing Malcolm to get out of bounds. Chicago also feels that any anonymous letters or calls at this time could possibly identify the source of the information and could, instead of causing disruption, solidify the royal family, that's Elijah Muhammad's family, the royal family and Malcolm. He went on to say, quote, it is felt that Malcolm's presence, this is right before Malcolm was ordered back to New York. It is felt that Malcolm's presence in Chicago is the most adequate form of disruption possible, as it is causing extreme discontent in the royal family and may well set off a chain reaction which could cause Malcolm to fall in disfavor with Muhammad. Now this was very important because what the Bureau is telling, and then from there they went on to outline a new disruption campaign in which they were going to plan a series of articles that was going to give the impression that Elijah Muhammad had retired and Malcolm was taking over the Nation of Islam. How did they come up with that? That was one of the major energies that was floating around that they knew was bothering the royal family, and it was bothering Elijah Muhammad. Now, as you get further into 1963, the whole question about the babies and the secretaries is then going to become more and more of an issue as well. And probably more than any other issue, the babies is going to be what's going to, how should we say, that's going to be the straw that broke the camel's back. From Malcolm's standpoint, he's going to have a problem understanding it and justifying it in the eyes of Elijah Muhammad. And I guess we need to understand how that worked as well. The way this thing worked was like this. As the rumors began to circulate more and more, Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad met and they discussed it. But what's going to happen is neither one of them are going to use a lot of direct terms. It was a sensitive issue, and I guess neither one of them really wanted to deal with it. So what's going to end up happening is they're going to leave that meeting with two different ideals of what had just transpired. Malcolm is going to leave that meeting thinking that Elijah Muhammad had given him permission to go and prepare some of the loyal officials on the East Coast to deal with it. He and Wallace had went through the Quran, they had went through the Bible, and they had come up with different ways to explain using, scriptures and prophecy and what have you. But at the same time, Elijah Muhammad left that same meeting thinking Malcolm had some plan. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was going to once and for all kind of put this under wraps. And so what's going to happen is Malcolm is going to return. He's going to talk to certain ministers. And one by one, they're going to call Chicago, and they're going to tell Chicago, Malcolm is down here spreading lies about you. He's spreading rumors about you and secretaries and babies. And so what that's going to begin to do in Elijah Muhammad's mind is going to begin to cast doubts as far as trust in his chief minister. And remember now, the Bureau has been doing that all along anyway, with this whole campaign of trying to make it seem as though Malcolm was power hungry. Malcolm was publicity hungry. Malcolm wanted to take over the nation and make Elijah Muhammad retire. So it's going to play very well. So that's going to be another issue, a major issue that's going to end up leading to the break. But there were some other issues that we need to deal with as well. A third issue was the fact that Malcolm had consistently wanted to make the nation more active in struggle. He consistently wanted to make the nation more community-oriented. But he met brick walls, primarily from the national leadership, who was satisfied. Remember now, they had become a very rich organization. A political organization is taxed. A political organization is under more scrutiny. And so it was very clear that various wings were developing inside the Nation of Islam. A more active-oriented wing and a more conservative-oriented wing. And the key to that conflict was Elijah Muhammad. That is, which side is he ultimately going to back? Well, in the final analysis, he's going to back the more conservative wing. So by the time you get to the end of 1963, and I'm really having to jump now, by the time you get to the end of 1963, Malcolm did not even realize it, but at that stage there were so many doubts in Elijah Muhammad's mind that Malcolm was on very thin ice, and he didn't even know it. So then when the Kennedy thing happened, in many ways that was nothing more than just a test. Nothing more. Malcolm was not set down in the nation so much for what he said about the Kennedy assassination as for the fact that he and other ministers has been ordered not to say anything about it. And there were many members, particularly amongst the national leadership, that had their fingers crossed anyway that Malcolm was going to slip up. And of course, in their eyes, he did. So once Malcolm was suspended, that brought us to another level. And this level was very significant because at this level, the Bureau's job at this stage was simply to do things to prevent Malcolm from rejoining the nation. And they did some of the same things that they did before. They planted newspaper articles, for example. They spread rumors. In fact, they were consistently spreading rumors that Malcolm was interviewing with reporters anonymously. They would spread rumors saying that Malcolm was spreading more and more rumors about the babies, and that's why he was out, and all these other types of things. And then in February, they hit real hard with a series of articles that were published in the New York Times, in the Chicago Sun-Times, in the Newark Star-Ledger. Very important, and in the Chicago Defender. Each of these newspapers published articles that gave the impression that Malcolm was consistently talking to reporters, A. B, that Malcolm was pretty much selling wolf tickets. In one article, they even quoted Malcolm as saying that when he returns to the fold, his power is going to be such that it's going to make his previous power pale in comparison. And he was quoted. And so it's going to give all the impression. And remember now, one of the stipulations of his suspension was he could not talk to reporters. The Bureau knew that. So they're going to utilize their newspaper campaign to the max. Now, something else is also going to happen during this period. Is also be very important. There's going to be talk and even an attempt made out of the New York mosque to assassinate Malcolm. Captain Joseph and others are going to put out energy and plant seeds and try to turn certain brothers against him. And that's going to become very important because the Bureau is going to learn that if this thing can keep going, the nation can take Malcolm out. That's going to be very important. And of course, that's going to be the level that the Bureau is going to work toward. Once Malcolm left the movement in March 1964, their goal at that stage was to inflame the conflict to the degree that with very little egging on the part of the Bureau, the nation would organize its forces enough to take Malcolm out. And they're going to do some very interesting things here. I'll give you a very quick example. June 1964, Malcolm spoke. Elijah Muhammad spoke. Both spoke on June 28th. And what's interesting is that prior to Elijah Muhammad speaking, there was a meeting of the FOI. And at this meeting, the enemy made a bogus phone call. And of course, the subject of this meeting was Malcolm X. Elijah Muhammad Jr. flew in. He was the assistant supreme captain of the FOI. They had 300 to 400 officers of the FOI in attendance. By the way, one group that was in that audience at that stage was from Mosque number 25. And for the last month, they had already been organizing to assassinate Malcolm X. But what was interesting is that at this meeting prior to Elijah Muhammad speaking, a bogus phone call was made by the enemy to that meeting in which a person said, I'm a follower of Malcolm X, and I want you to know that when Elijah Muhammad speaks at the Armory in the next day or so, Malcolm has made plans for his followers to kill him. And that's all those members needed to hear. And in fact, this was also the meeting in which Elijah Muhammad Jr. spoke before this group, and he basically, told them to, for lack of a better term, he told them to just basically go to Malcolm's house, beat down on the walls so they come tumbling down, cut out his tongue, put it in an envelope, send it to him, and then he will get it stamped and approved and signed by the messenger. Everybody who I've talked to who attended that meeting contend that if anybody knowed how the FOI worked in those days, that was plain and simple him basically telling them whoever can kill this man first will be rewarded. And that's very clear. But what we already know is that the Newark team that's going to ultimately assassinate Malcolm had already been organized for a month anyway. So we cannot even say, well, that's what authorized Malcolm's assassination. Now, something else is also very important here that we don't want to miss, and that is this. Elijah Muhammad Jr. was deemed the voice piece of Elijah Muhammad. And therefore, there was this notion that when Elijah Muhammad Jr. spoke, he spoke under the authority, under the authorization, and under the auspices of his father. Now, of course, in some ways that wasn't even necessary to make that point because Elijah Muhammad himself in that same month had given a speech in Houston in which he basically said the same thing and talked about how hypocrites like Malcolm needed to be blasted from the face of the earth. Now, what is all of this beginning to mean? It's very simple. It means that as much as I would have liked to have exonerated the nation did too much in all of this to justify that. And remember now, organizations like the nation, like the intelligence community, they worked on post-suggestion. Meaning, if you wanted something sensitive done, you don't say to them, yo, I want you to go do it. Just like that. You use different terminology. People move based on energy. It's the same way the intelligence community works. Energy. Elijah Muhammad gave every indication that he wanted Malcolm destroyed at all costs. And then he had a litany of ministers. Minister James from Newark, Minister Lewis from Boston, Minister Lonnie from D.C., Minister Isaiah from Baltimore, Captain Joseph, a litany of officials who consistently wrote articles in the newspapers. In fact, the newspapers in 1964 got so blatant in their denunciation of Malcolm that several former members of the nation have remarked that when they were reading it, it could have just as well have read death order. That's the contradiction that our people have to deal with. Now, let me switch back real quickly to the nation. To the enemy real quickly. I got 10 minutes. Okay. Let me switch back real quickly to the enemy. Now, what's the enemy doing in all of this? The enemy's job is actually very simple. And by the way, let's understand what counterintelligence is. Counterintelligence is when you, as an intelligence operator, plant a seed, and then you sit back and you watch that seed bear fruit and hopefully do one or more things that you hope it will do. In other words, you watch the extent to which people react to it. And the best type of counterintelligence is the counterintelligence, as one former CIA official said, that remains secret from inception to eternity. Meaning that the best counterintelligence operators, only them and their supervisors know the great work that they did because it's supposed to be in the background. So in the case of Malcolm, all the enemy was doing was just planting seeds behind closed doors. They were spreading their rumors. They were putting in their newspapers. But everything that they were doing, the key to everything that they were doing was based upon how the nation reacted to Malcolm. And see, they had studied the nation well enough to know that the nation would go after one of us in a second. And I want you to understand this very clearly. If you study the history of the nation hasn't went after the enemy. But if you study the nation, even during the 1960s and stuff, they took out many former Muslims, but not the enemy. And the FBI knew that. The FBI appreciated that. So all they needed to do, by the way, just so that we're clear on something, the goal here is not to bash the nation. The goal here is to expose these contradictions so we can stop playing these silly games. Okay? So the point that I was making is that the Bureau knew that if you keep planting on their own, they're going to take him out. And that's all they wanted. And then at that stage of the game, their role, they could then conceal easily because they were going to play a role in getting the suspects. They're going to play a role in the trial. In other words, they can then direct the aftermath. And that's what they're going to do. And you know, it's such a, it's despicable to have to research how the enemy used us during all of this. Is despicable. This is how bad they used us. You know that two brothers from Mosque number 7, Thomas 15X Johnson, Norman 3X Butler were, of course, convicted, along with Talmadge Chair. And, of course, as everybody here is probably aware, both Butler and Johnson were innocent. But this is what's amazing. The Bureau knew that Johnson and Butler were innocent. How do we know that? It's simple. The Bureau's own documents told me. I'll give you an example.